Naima stumbled through the dense undergrowth, her bare feet scraping against the rough forest. The darkness around her felt suffocating, the towering trees stretching endlessly in all directions. She had been running for what felt like hours, but there was no sign of an exit, no break in the thick canopy above, no hint of a path leading back to civilization. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Her dress was torn, clinging to her sweat-drenched skin, the once vibrant fabric now covered in dirt and dried leaves. A deep gash on her arm burned as sweat trickled into it, a cruel reminder of the sharp branch she had run into earlier. But she couldn't stop. She didn't know what she was running from anymore, her past, her fate, or the eerie silence of the forest itself. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, breaking the unnerving quiet. She flinched at the sound, her heart pounding violently in her chest. Every rustling leaf, every whisper of the wind felt like an unseen presence watching her, waiting for her to collapse. She wasn't alone. Naima tried to remember how she had gotten here, but her thoughts were clouded by panic. She pressed her fingers to her temples, forcing herself to focus. The last thing she remembered clearly was running. Running blindly, her pulse hammering in her ears, the weight of betrayal crushing her soul. A sharp pang of sorrow cut through her chest as images flashed before her eyes, her home, the people she thought she could trust, the man she was meant to marry. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the memories refused to fade. She had been raised in a village where traditions were strict, where a girl's fate was sealed the moment she reached womanhood. Her stepmother had never cared for her, treating her as an inconvenience rather than a daughter. But Naima had always found solace in her father, his gentle voice, his protective embrace. He had promised to keep her safe. He had sworn she would never suffer the same fate as other young girls who were married off against their will. But promises were nothing but empty words. Naima had overheard them talking, the hushed whispers of her stepmother, the laughter of the man who had come to claim her. He was old, cruel, and powerful. A merchant with enough wealth to buy anything, including a young, unwilling bride. Her father had stood silent. His face had been grim, his eyes dark with something Naima couldn't understand. Was it regret? Fear? Or had he been complicit all along? The betrayal had struck her harder than any physical wound. She had waited for nightfall, packing only what she could carry before slipping out into the darkness. She hadn't known where she was going, only that she had to run. But the farther she ran, the more unfamiliar the land became. Until finally, she found herself here. Lost. Her stomach twisted painfully, a reminder that she hadn't eaten in hours. She stumbled forward, her fingers brushing against the rough bark of a tree as she steadied herself. She needed water, food, anything to keep going. But the deeper she wandered, the more the forest seemed to close in around her. A sudden rustling in the bushes made her freeze. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned sharply, eyes wide with terror. Something was there. Watching. Waiting. She forced herself to take a step back, then another. The sound stopped. Silence stretched out between her and the unseen presence, so thick it made her ears ring. "Hello?" Her voice was barely a whisper, trembling with fear. No answer. Only the whisper of the wind through the trees. She swallowed hard and turned away. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe her mind was playing tricks on her. But as she took another step forward, the whispers began. They were faint at first, like the wind shifting through the leaves, but then they grew clearer, words spoken just out of reach, voices that didn't belong to the living. Naima's body went rigid. She wasn't imagining it. The voices were real. And they were calling to her. She broke into a run, ignoring the burning in her legs, the ache in her chest. She had to get out. But the forest had other plans. Naima's legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed onto the damp forest floor, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The hunger and exhaustion had become unbearable, her body finally betraying her. She had pushed herself too far, too fast. The world around her swayed as her vision blurred, and for a moment, she thought she might lose consciousness. Then, voices. Rough, low voices, speaking a language she didn't fully understand. Footsteps rustled through the fallen leaves, approaching her from different directions. Fear gripped her chest, but her body was too weak to respond. A shadow loomed over her. "Are you all right?" The voice was deep, smooth, and strangely comforting. She forced herself to look up, her vision swimming. A tall man knelt beside her, his dark eyes filled with something that resembled concern. He had strong, chiseled features and long, braided hair that fell past his shoulders. His clothes were made of rough, woven fabric, and his arms were adorned with tribal markings. "You are far from any village," he continued, his tone soft, measured. "What happened to you?" Naima tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. All she managed was a faint croak. The man frowned, then turned his head slightly. "Tarek, give her water." Another man appeared, carrying a small leather pouch. He crouched beside Naima and lifted her head gently, pressing the spout of the pouch to her lips. Cool, clean water trickled down her throat, and she drank greedily, the relief almost making her dizzy. "You should drink slowly," Tarek murmured, his voice kinder than she expected. He was younger than the first man, his face lean but handsome, his dark eyes filled with something unreadable. The first man, the one who had spoken first, watched her carefully. "My name is Jabari," he said. "You are safe now." Safe. The word echoed in her mind, but something about it felt off. Naima tried to sit up, but Jabari placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Careful," he said. "You are weak. Rest for a moment." She hesitated but nodded slightly. Her body ached, and the warmth of their presence, of human voices after the endless silence of the forest, was tempting. Tarek handed her a piece of dried meat and a small handful of nuts. "Eat," he urged. "You need strength." Naima hesitated again. The past day had been nothing but suffering, but now she was being offered kindness. Shelter. Food. Water. But at what cost? She took the food carefully, watching them as she chewed. The taste was strange, but she forced herself to swallow. A third man stood a few feet away, half hidden in the shadows of the trees. Unlike the others, he said nothing. He simply watched. His gaze was unsettling. Naima shifted uncomfortably. Who are you?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Jabari smiled, his white teeth flashing against his dark skin. "We live in the forest," he said simply. "Hunters, traders. Sometimes we take travelers to safety when they are lost." She swallowed, glancing around. There were 4 of them now, all rugged and strong, their movements fluid, like they belonged to this place in a way she never could. Where's the nearest village?" she asked hesitantly. Silence. Jabari's smile didn't falter, but something in his eyes shifted. "Far," he said finally. "Too far for you to travel tonight." Naima frowned. "But you should rest," Tarek interrupted smoothly. "We have a fire nearby. You can sleep there." The words should have comforted her, but instead, a cold sensation crept up her spine. Something was wrong. Jabari stood and extended a hand toward her. "Come. You will be safe with us." Safe. That word again. Naima hesitated. Then, slowly, she reached for his hand. His grip was firm, but not forceful, and he pulled her to her feet as if she weighed nothing. As they led her deeper into the forest, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just stepped into something far worse than the wilderness she had left behind. Omari, the silent one, never stopped watching her. Like a predator waiting for its moment. Naima's body stirred before her mind did. Her senses returned one by one, the faint scent of burning wood, the rough texture of straw beneath her, the distant sound of rustling leaves. For a brief, blissful moment, she thought she was home, waking up to another ordinary morning. But then she opened her eyes. The dim interior of the hut came into focus, lit only by the flickering glow of a small fire outside. The walls were made of rough wooden planks, hastily bound together. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic. Blood? Naima's heart pounded as she sat up, suddenly aware of the heavy silence pressing down on her. This was not a village hut. This was a cage. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the wave of dizziness that washed over her. Her eyes darted to the only exit, a thick wooden door, secured with a crude but sturdy latch on the outside. She rushed toward it, pressing her palms against the rough wood, feeling for any weakness. Locked. She stepped back, her breathing growing shallow. Why was she locked in? Footsteps approached. She barely had time to move before the door creaked open, and Tarek stepped inside. He was holding a small wooden bowl filled with steaming broth, his expression unreadable. "You are awake," he said softly, as if he had been expecting her to panic. Naima took a step back, her heart hammering. "Why am I locked in here?" she demanded. Tarek sighed, setting the bowl down on the floor. "You don't understand. It's for your own safety." She stared at him. "Safety?" He nodded. "The forest is dangerous at night. There are things out there, things that prey on the weak." Naima swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling uneasily in her chest. "Then why are you free? Why do you get to walk outside while I'm trapped in here?" Tarek hesitated for only a second, but it was enough. A flicker of something, guilt, hesitation, or something darker, crossed his face before he covered it with another reassuring smile. "You are not ready to be outside yet," he said. "Jabari will explain everything to you soon." The way he spoke made her skin crawl. He wasn't reassuring her. He was stalling her. Naima's eyes flickered toward the door, then back to Tarek. She forced herself to take a slow breath, steadying her voice. "I want to leave," she said. "Now." Tarek's smile faded. "You can't leave." The words sent a chill down her spine. She clenched her fists. "This isn't protection. This is imprisonment." Tarek sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I didn't want this to be difficult for you, Naima. We saved you. You should be grateful." "Grateful?" Her stomach twisted with fear. This wasn't a misunderstanding. They had never planned to let her go. The realization sent a surge of panic through her veins, but she forced herself to remain calm. She needed to think. She needed to find a way out. Tarek stood there for a moment, watching her with something almost like pity. Then he turned and walked out, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. The lock clicked into place. Naima waited, listening to his footsteps fade. Then she moved. She scanned the room quickly. There had to be a way out. The walls were sturdy, but the roof? It was made of thin wooden planks, tied together with rope. If she could loosen one, maybe she could slip through. Her fingers worked quickly, pulling at the knots, her heart pounding in her ears. The wood groaned as she wrenched a plank free. Then, a sound outside. Voices. Approaching. She had no time to hesitate. Naima hoisted herself up, her arms screaming in protest as she climbed through the gap in the roof. Her body scraped against the rough wood, but she didn't stop. Freedom was within reach. She dropped to the ground outside, landing on her feet but nearly falling forward. She ran. Her bare feet pounded against the forest floor, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. The world around her blurred, but she didn't stop, she couldn't stop. Then, a hand clamped down on her wrist. Naima screamed as she was yanked back, her body colliding with something solid. A strong arm wrapped around her, pinning her against a firm chest. "Going somewhere?" Jabari's voice was smooth, almost amused. But when she looked up at his face, his eyes were dark. Too dark. Naima struggled, kicking and thrashing, but he didn't even flinch. His grip tightened, his strength effortless. "You belong to us now," he murmured. She felt the words sink into her bones, cold and final. The forest around them shifted. The wind picked up, carrying whispers, low and ancient, like a language she wasn't meant to understand. The trees moved, their branches curling like fingers. Jabari stiffened, his hold on her faltering for just a moment. Naima's breath caught. Something else was here. Watching. Waiting. And it wasn't human. Naima's body trembled as Jabari dragged her back through the forest, his grip firm but eerily controlled. The other men followed closely behind, their faces hidden in the dim glow of the moon filtering through the dense canopy. The whispering wind sent chills down her spine, and she could still feel the strange energy pulsing through the trees. When they reached the camp, she was thrown back into the hut, the wooden walls seeming to close in around her. Her heart pounded as she scrambled to her feet, her wild eyes darting to Jabari, Tariq, and Omari, who stood in the doorway. Jabari's gaze was different now, no longer gentle, no longer pretending. He was looking at her the way a lion looks at a caged gazelle. "You belong to us now," he repeated, his voice smooth, deliberate. Naima shook her head violently. "I don't belong to anyone." Jabari chuckled, stepping forward. "We saved you. It is only fair that you repay us." Her stomach twisted. "Repay you?" Jabari reached out, tracing a rough finger down her arm. "You will be my bride." Naima recoiled, slapping his hand away. "Never," she spat, rage flaring in her chest. Omari chuckled from the doorway, arms crossed. His dark eyes glowed with amusement. "Oh, you will." His voice was low, almost teasing. "You can't run from fate." She glared at him. "You're all insane." Tariq shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze, but he didn't speak up. He was complicit. They all were. Jabari sighed. "We could have made this easy for you." He turned to the others and gave a slight nod. "Begin the preparations." 2 more men entered the hut, carrying wooden bowls filled with thick, dark liquid. The scent of strange herbs filled the air, mixed with something more pungent, something metallic. Blood. Naima's pulse quickened. She backed away until she hit the wall, her breathing erratic. "What is this?" she demanded. Jabari's expression softened, as if he truly believed his next words. "A ritual. You will be bound to me." Naima's eyes widened. "Like hell I will." Her body moved before her mind did. She lunged forward, her nails raking across Jabari's face, drawing blood. His head snapped to the side, but he barely reacted. Tariq tried to grab her wrist, but she twisted, slamming her elbow into his stomach. He grunted, staggering back. Omari only laughed, watching with gleeful eyes. "Fiery. I like that." Naima turned to run, but Jabari was faster. His arm wrapped around her waist, yanking her back against him. She kicked, bit, thrashed wildly, refusing to submit. "You will break," he murmured against her ear. "Never," she hissed, slamming her head back into his nose. He let out a sharp growl, his grip faltering just enough for her to slip free. Naima bolted for the door. But before she could reach it, a shadow moved outside. She skidded to a halt, her breath catching. A man stood just beyond the firelight, cloaked in darkness. His posture was eerily still, his face obscured by the night. The air around him was different, charged with something ancient, something powerful. Jabari stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "You," he muttered. The stranger said nothing. He simply watched. Naima's heart pounded as she realized something chilling. Whoever he wasn't one of them. The air inside the hut thickened, pressing against Naima's chest like an invisible weight. Jabari's fingers dug into her arm, his grip firm, unyielding. The firelight cast flickering shadows across his face, but even in the dim glow, she could see something new in his expression, hesitation. Outside, the stranger still stood at the edge of the camp, his presence like a silent warning. The way he didn't move, didn't speak, sent an eerie shiver down Naima's spine. Who was he? What did he want? Omari's fingers twitched against the hilt of his knife, his impatience evident. "I don't like this," he muttered. "Why is he just standing there?" Tarek shifted uneasily. Maybe we should. No, Jabari interrupted, his voice sharp. He turned his gaze back to Naima, his jaw tightening. We finished the ritual. Now. At his command, the other men moved swiftly. Two of them grabbed Naima's arms, forcing her toward the center of the hut. She struggled, her heart hammering in her chest. The wooden bowls of dark liquid were placed before her, the scent of strange herbs and something metallic, blood, filling the air. Naima's stomach turned. I will never be yours, she spat. Jabari stepped closer, tilting his head slightly. His dark eyes gleamed. You will. Then, just as one of the men reached for the thick, crimson mixture in the bowl, the wind changed. It started as a whisper, a cold breath that slithered through the gaps in the wooden walls. Then, it howled, violent and unnatural. The flames in the fire pit outside shuddered. The torches flickered wildly. And then, they went out. The entire camp was plunged into darkness. Naima's breath hitched. The sudden void of light felt suffocating, as if the very night had swallowed them whole. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She could hear the men shifting around her, their confused muttering. What the hell? Omari's voice cut through the silence, but he was quickly drowned out by something far more terrifying. The whispering. It came from everywhere. The trees, the wind, the earth beneath them. Deep, guttural voices, speaking a language Naima didn't recognize but somehow felt. The walls of the hut trembled. Outside, the branches twisted violently, as though writhing in agony. Tarek let out a strangled gasp. What is happening? Omari growled, it's just a storm. But Jabari knew better. He stood rigid, his fists clenched, his breathing heavy. His eyes darted toward the darkness beyond the hut, toward the stranger, who still hadn't moved. This isn't a storm, he murmured, almost to himself. His voice lacked its usual arrogance. Naima could feel something inside her shifting. A pressure, a force deep within, twisting and clawing to be set free. Her entire body tingled, her veins pulsing with an energy she didn't understand. Then, without thinking, without meaning to, she screamed. The moment her voice tore through the air, the world erupted. The wind exploded outward, a force so powerful it sent Jabari and the others crashing to the ground. The bowls of ritualistic blood shattered, the crimson liquid splattering across the hut's walls. The wooden planks creaked violently, as though the very structure was being tested by something unseen. Naima gasped as she felt the air around her ripple, bend. The darkness deepened, swallowing everything in its path. The torches were long dead, but now, even the moonlight had vanished. It was more than night. It was nothingness. And then, a voice. Soft, distant, yet everywhere at once. She awakens. Naima's blood ran cold. The whisper wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from inside her. Jabari pushed himself up onto his elbows, his face pale, his lips slightly parted. He stared at her, not in anger, not in dominance, but in something she had never seen from him before. Fear. Omari, still on the ground, let out a shaken breath. What the hell is she? The whispering from the forest grew louder, closer. The stranger outside finally moved. And in that moment, Naima understood. She was not alone in this body. Naima's breathing was ragged, her body trembling from the surge of energy that had just torn through the camp. The darkness around them was thick and suffocating, alive with whispers from the forest. The men who had once held her captive now lay sprawled across the ground, stunned by a force they couldn't comprehend. Then, he moved. The stranger, who had been standing just beyond the firelight all this time, took his first deliberate step forward. Jabari, still on his knees, flinched at the movement. His eyes widened in recognition, his fingers twitching toward his weapon, but he hesitated. He was afraid. Naima saw it. Jabari, the man who had claimed her as his, who had looked at her with the arrogance of someone who believed himself untouchable, was afraid of this stranger. A deep silence settled over the camp as the man stepped fully into view. He was tall, his features sharp, his skin as dark as the night that had swallowed them. His eyes, barely visible in the flickering remnants of dying embers, glowed faintly, a golden hue that was not natural. Omari, still sprawled on the ground, gritted his teeth. "Stay out of this," he growled, pushing himself up, but even his voice lacked its usual venom. "This has nothing to do with you." The stranger ignored him. His gaze flickered to Naima, and for the first time, she saw something in those glowing eyes, recognition. He knew. He knew what had happened to her. He knew what she had done. A cold shiver ran down her spine. Jabari slowly rose to his feet, his hands clenched into fists. He wasn't backing down, but his confidence was fractured. "You shouldn't be here," he said through gritted teeth. "She belongs to me." The stranger tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Then, his lips curled, not in a smile, but in something dangerously close to amusement. "I don't think she does," he said, his voice smooth, controlled. "And neither do you." Jabari stiffened. For a brief moment, the wind stilled, and the forest held its breath. Then, Jabari lunged. His blade sliced through the air, aiming for the stranger's throat. It was fast, too fast, but before the blade could make contact, the stranger raised his hand. And everything stopped. The air itself seemed to solidify. Jabari's body froze mid-motion, his weapon hovering inches from the stranger's skin. His eyes widened in horror as he realized he couldn't move. Omari and Tariq scrambled back, their faces twisted in shock. The other men, still regaining their footing, hesitated, watching the impossible unfold before them. The stranger didn't flinch. His glowing gaze bore into Jabari's, filled with something ancient, something powerful. "Sit," he commanded. Jabari's body jerked, and then he dropped. His knees slammed into the dirt, his hands trembling as though an unseen force had crushed him. His breath came in ragged gasps, his muscles straining against something invisible. Omari cursed, gripping his knife tighter. "What are you?" The stranger ignored him. Instead, he turned to Naima. "Are you hurt?" he asked. Naima's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her mind was still reeling, struggling to process what had just happened. He had stopped Jabari without touching him. He had power. Like she did. Swallowing hard, she forced herself to speak. "Who are you?" The stranger's jaw tightened slightly. "That doesn't matter." Naima frowned. "It does to me." He held her gaze for a long moment before sighing. "I am the one who just saved your life," he said simply. "And the one who is telling you, you need to leave. Now." Naima clenched her fists. "Why? What's happening to me?" He hesitated. "You're awakening." Her breath hitched. "Awakening to what?" His eyes darkened. Something that should have stayed buried. A gust of wind howled through the trees once more, as if agreeing with his words. The whispering from the forest grew louder. And Naima knew, whatever had begun tonight was far from over. The ground trembled beneath them, a deep, guttural rumble that sent chills through Naima's spine. The wind howled, no longer a natural force but something alive. The trees groaned and twisted, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal fingers toward the men who had tormented her. Jabari struggled against the invisible weight pressing him down, his body still locked in place by the stranger's power. His breath came in ragged gasps, his eyes darting wildly. "What is this?" he snarled, his voice laced with desperation. The stranger didn't answer. He only watched, his expression unreadable, as the forest answered instead. A sharp cry split the air. "Tariq!" His body jerked violently as a vine, thick and writhing like a living snake, shot from the earth and wrapped around his ankle. He yelped, slashing at it with his knife, but more vines erupted, coiling around his wrists, his neck. They dragged him backward, his screams fading as the darkness swallowed him whole. Omari stumbled away from the scene, panting. "Jabari, do something!" Jabari gritted his teeth, but he was still pinned, his muscles trembling against an unseen force. "This isn't real," he hissed. "This is some kind of..." A shadow moved. Not a person. Not an animal. Something else. It slithered across the ground, stretching unnaturally toward Omari. He turned to run, but before he could take a single step, the darkness rose, twisting, forming a hand that grabbed his leg. Omari screamed. The shadow yanked him down, dragging him into the black abyss. His hands clawed at the dirt, his eyes wide with terror. "No! No! His final cry was cut short as the darkness consumed him. Naima stood frozen, her heart pounding. This was the forest's doing. It had watched. It had waited. And now, it was taking back what was stolen. She turned to Jabari. He was still on his knees, panting, his face pale. But his fear wasn't just for what was happening now. It was deeper than that. Because he knew this was coming. Naima narrowed her eyes. "This isn't your first time, is it?" Jabari's breath hitched. The stranger tilted his head slightly. "No," he murmured. "It isn't." The forest seemed to react to those words. The branches above twisted, cracking like bones. The whispers grew louder, an angry chorus carried by the wind. Naima clenched her fists. Her own rage boiled beneath her skin. She had spent so much time feeling powerless. Afraid. But now, she felt something else. A force within her. A connection to the forest, to the whispers, to the very air that crackled with unseen power. She wasn't afraid anymore. Jabari saw it. His gaze snapped to her, and for the first time, she saw true panic in his eyes. "No," he rasped. "You don't understand." But she did. She raised her hand. The ground beneath Jabari split open. Dark tendrils burst from the earth, wrapping around his arms, his legs, pulling him down inch by inch. His struggles were useless. The forest had judged him. "No! You can't," his scream was raw, desperate. "Naima, please." She stepped forward, standing over him. "You wanted me to be yours." Jabari's eyes were wild with terror. I was wrong. She tilted her head. "Then you will belong to the forest instead." With a final, ear-splitting wail, Jabari was dragged into the earth. The dirt closed over him, silencing him forever. The whispers faded. The wind calmed. The trees stood still once more. Naima exhaled shakily. The power still hummed in her veins, but it didn't feel foreign anymore. It felt like hers. The stranger watched her carefully. "You didn't just survive," he murmured. "You changed." She turned to face him. "What am I?" He studied her for a moment before saying, "The beginning of something powerful." Naima glanced at the quiet, darkened forest around her. It had saved her. Protected her. And now, it belonged to her just as much as she belonged to it. She wasn't the victim anymore. She was something else entirely. The air was still. The whispers of the forest had faded into silence, and the ground had swallowed every trace of her captors. Only the stranger remained, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching her. Naima took a shaky breath. The power still hummed beneath her skin, a deep and ancient force that now felt like an extension of herself. She wasn't the same girl who had stumbled into the forest, lost and afraid. She wasn't a victim anymore. The stranger finally spoke. "You understand now, don't you?" She turned to him, her gaze steady. "That I wasn't lost. That I was meant to come here." He nodded. "This place, it doesn't just take in anyone. It calls to those who belong." Naima frowned. "You mean? I was always meant to be here." He stepped closer, his golden eyes unreadable. "The forest doesn't choose lightly. It sees inside you. Your pain. Your strength. Your rage." He paused. It judges. Naima thought back to the moment she had screamed, when the torches had died, when the wind had howled as if sharing in her fury. The forest had answered her. It had avenged her. What would have happened if I was weak, she asked. The stranger's lips pressed into a thin line. Then you would have been another victim. A chill ran down her spine. The forest tested her. The men were never meant to walk away. But she had a choice. She clenched her fists, looking at the dark trees surrounding them. How many girls came before me? The stranger exhaled slowly. Too many. Her stomach twisted. And no one saved them? He hesitated before answering. Some fought. Some ran. Some lost. His gaze darkened. But you? You didn't just survive. Naima met his eyes. I changed. The wind rustled the trees again, soft this time, almost approving. She understood now. The forest had taken revenge for those girls. But it had also chosen her. The stranger tilted his head. What will you do now? She looked at the spot where Jabari had disappeared. The others had fallen into the darkness, their fate sealed. But she was still here. The only one left standing. A slow realization settled over her. I can't leave, she whispered. The stranger didn't look surprised. No, he said quietly. You can't. Because she wasn't meant to escape. She was meant to stay. To protect this place. To make sure no girl was ever trapped again. Naima turned to the stranger. You knew this all along, didn't you? A small, knowing smile touched his lips. I only knew what the forest whispered. Naima took a deep breath, letting the truth settle. She was never meant to be a victim. She was meant to be its guardian. And she would make sure no one else suffered as she had.